It was a Wednesday in late September, and Nero Wolfe was doing what he does best, nothing in particular, but doing it with the concentrated intensity of a man who has elevated idleness to an art form. He was in his oversized chair behind his desk, working through the crossword puzzle in the Times with a gold-plated pen that costs more than most people's watches, out pausing occasionally to sip from a glass of beer that Fritz had poured exactly 7 minutes ago at precisely the right temperature. I was at my desk near the door, typing up the final invoice for our last Cases Society matron who'd been convinced her husband was poisoning her cats, this when in fact the cats were just old and dying of natural causes, which apparently wasn't dramatic enough for her. The check had cleared, the bank account was comfortable, and Wolfe was in the dangerous state of being both solvent and bored. That's when the telephone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin, the voice, was female, cultured, and shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. My name is Marion Hewitt. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about my husband. He's been murdered. I sat up straighter. When? Last night. The police say it was a burglary. But it wasn't. It couldn't have been. And they've already closed the case, Mr. Goodwin. They're not even investigating anymore. Please, I need help. I glanced at Wolfe. I'd put down his pen and was watching me with the expression of a man who knows exactly what's about to ruin his evening and is already calculating how much it will cost to make the problem go away. Mrs. Hewitt, can you come to Mr. Wolfe's office tomorrow morning at 11? I can be there in 20 minutes. Mrs. Hewitt, please. I'm 3 blocks away. I've been sitting in my car for an hour, trying to work up the courage to call you. If I go home now, I'll lose my nerve entirely. I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe. Murder victim's widow, 3 blocks away, desperate, and heading this way in 20 minutes whether we like it or not. Wolfe's eyes closed in the way they do when he's communing with his personal gods of beer, food, and uninterrupted peace. No, she says the police have already closed the case. Then the police are satisfied. Why shouldn't we be? Because satisfied police don't always mean satisfied justice. And because she sounds like she's about to come through the phone and camp out on our doorstep if I say no, let her camp. It's a pleasant evening. She'll enjoy the fresh air. Wolfe, Archie, I am working on a crossword puzzle. I am drinking beer. Fritz is preparing duck L orange for dinner. The orchids are thriving, and my life is, at this moment, precisely as it should be. I will not allow a hysterical widow to disrupt this equilibrium merely because her husband had the poor judgment to get himself murdered. She's already disrupted. The only question is whether you talk to her now or listen to the doorbell ring for the next 3 hours. His eyes opened and he gave me the look that means I've won the argument, but will pay for it later in small, petty ways involving assignments he knows I'll hate. 20 minutes, he said. If she cannot state her case in 20 minutes, Please, I'll tell her. I uncovered the phone. Mrs. Hewitt, come to the brownstone. Ring the bell. I'll let you in.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin.
Thank you so much. She hung up, and I put the phone down and looked at Wolfe, who had returned to his crossword puzzle with the grim determination of a man fortifying himself for battle. What's a 7-letter word for inevitable disaster? He asked. Clients, I suggested. He grunted and wrote it in. Marion Hewitt arrived in exactly 18 minutes. She told me 2 things. She'd been telling the truth about being 3 blocks away, and she'd probably broken several traffic laws getting here. I watched through the one-way glass panel as she climbed the steps to our stoop, a woman in her mid-40s. Well-dressed in a navy suit and pearls, with gray blonde hair pinned back, and the kind of face that belonged on a headmistress or a Supreme Court justice. Composed, dignified, and holding herself together with what looked like pure willpower. Possibly prescription medication. I opened the door before she could ring. Mrs. Hewitt? Yes, Mr. Goodwin. That's me. Come in. She stepped into the hall and looked around with the quick, assessing glance of someone used to evaluating things, furniture, art, people. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed by approximately 1/8 of an inch. I led her to the office. Wolfe had put away his crossword puzzle and was sitting with his hands interlaced over his center of gravity, looking like a Buddha who'd just been informed that enlightenment had been postponed indefinitely. Mrs. Hewitt, I said, this is Nero Wolfe. She nodded to him. Mr. Wolfe, thank you for seeing me. I haven't seen you yet, madam. I've merely agreed to listen. Please sit. She took the red leather chair, the one reserved for clients, supplicants, and people about to have their carefully constructed lies taken apart like a cheap watch. I sat at my desk and flipped open my notebook. Your husband was murdered, Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. Yes, last night, Tuesday, September 26th, in our home in Riverside Drive. How? He was shot. Once, in the chest. The police say it was a burglar, that someone broke in through the study window. My husband surprised them, and they shot him and fled. They found the window open, some items missing from his desk, his wallet gone. And you believe this is incorrect? No, it's incorrect, Mr. Wolfe. My husband was a careful man, obsessively careful. He checked every lock in the house before bed, every single night, the windows, the doors, everything. He had insomnia, you see. He'd lie awake for hours, worrying about things. Security was one of his worries. It's the idea that he'd leave his study. Window open is absurd. Perhaps the burglar opened it.
Ow.
From the outside, we're on the 4th floor, Mr. Wolfe. There's no fire escape, no ledge, no way to reach that window except from inside the apartment. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. I see. And what does Inspector Kramer say about this? Inspector Kramer says my husband must have opened the window himself earlier in the day and forgotten about it. That he was getting older, becoming forgetful. But he wasn't forgetful, Mr. Wolfe. He was meticulous. He remembered everything: appointments, names, conversations from 20 years ago. He would never have forgotten to close that window. Yet someone opened it. Yes, someone who was already inside the apartment. Someone who killed my husband and then staged a burglary to cover it up. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, studying her the way an entomologist studies a particularly interesting specimen. Mrs. Hewitt, if the police have closed the case, why do you need me? Because they won't listen. Inspector Kramer says I'm in denial, that I can't accept the random violence of it. He says I'm looking for patterns where there are none, meaning where there is only chaos. Her voice cracked slightly. But I know my husband, Mr. Wolfe, and I know he was murdered by someone who knew him.
Ow.
Someone who had access to our home. Someone who planned it carefully and executed it perfectly. Someone who made it look like a burglary. Someone who made it look like the perfect burglary. Except for the window. Wolfe leaned back and his chair creaked ominously. Mrs. Hewitt, even if I accept your premise, which I have not yet done, you have given me nothing to work with. No suspects, no motive, no evidence beyond your conviction that your husband was too careful to leave a window open. That is not a case. That is a feeling, then. Let me give you more. She opened her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. 3 weeks ago, my husband changed his will. He didn't tell Maya, found out yesterday when his lawyer called. The old will left everything to me. The new will leaves half his estate to me and half to his business partner, Gerald Morse.
How much?
My husband was worth approximately $2 million, Mr. Wolfe, which means Gerald Morse stands to inherit $1 million. Wolfe's eyes gleamed with the expression that means he's found something interesting hiding in the underbrush of human stupidity. Did Mr. Morse know about this new will? I don't know, but I intend to find out. And what was your husband's business? Was an architect. Hewitt and Morse Architecture. They designed office buildings, museums, libraries. Very successful, very prestigious. They'd been partners for 20 years. Were they friendly? They were cordial, professional. My husband didn't have friends. Mr. Wolfe had colleagues, clients, and me. He wasn't built for friendship. Was he built for enemies? She smiled, but it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. Everyone who's successful has enemies, Mr. Wolfe. The question is whether any of them hated him enough to kill him. Wolfe poured beer, drank, and set the glass down with the finality of a judge's gavel. Mrs. Hewitt, I will consider your case. Mr. Goodwin will investigate. He will speak with Mr. Morse, with the police, with anyone else who might have information. If I determine that your husband's death was indeed murder disguised as burglary, I will find the killer. If I determine that it was in fact a burglary, I will inform you of that as well. My fee is $100 per day plus expenses. with a retainer of $500. She already had her checkbook out. I'll pay $1,000 as retainer. And Mr. Wolfe? Yes. Find who killed my husband, please. I need to know why. She wrote the check, handed it to me, and left. After the front door closed behind her, Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute. Then he said, Archie, what did you observe? A woman who believes her husband was murdered by someone close to him? A woman who's smart enough to notice an open window on the 4th floor and logical enough to understand what it means? And a woman who's desperate enough to pay double your retainer without blinking. Indeed. And what does that tell you? That she's either right about the murder, or she's so desperate to believe it wasn't random that she'd pay anything to confirm her theory. Precisely. Which means we must be very careful not to give her the answer she wants, but rather the answer that is true. He picked up his beer. Tomorrow morning, you will visit the scene of the crime and speak with Mr. Gerald Morse. I want to know about the will, about the business, and about the relationship between these two partners. I want to know who had access to that apartment and who had reason to want Richard Hewitt dead. And if it really was just a burglary, then we will have earned our fee by confirming an unpleasant truth. But I suspect, Archie, that this case is not what it appears to be. The window troubles me considerably. He opened his book, a biography of Escoffier. This time Anne dismissed me with a wave of one hand. I went upstairs to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Somewhere in my mind, a 4th floor window hung open, and beyond it, nothing but air and questions. Thursday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn weather that makes New York look like it's posing for a postcard. I left the brownstone at 9, while Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids, communing with cattleyas and phalaenopsis and whatever other tongue-twisting Latin names he'd given to his children. The Hewitt apartment was on Riverside Drive, one of those pre-war buildings where the doormen wear uniforms that cost more than my suits and look at you like they're deciding whether to call the police or just escort you out themselves. I gave my name, mentioned Mrs. Hewitt, and was directed to the 4th floor with the kind of reluctant courtesy that suggested I'd just barely passed. Inspection, Mrs. Hewitt answered the door, looking like she'd aged another 10 years overnight. The pearls were gone, replaced by a simple black dress. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry past crying, into that terrible numbness that comes after. Mr. Goodwin, thank you for coming.
Ike.
Just doing my job, Mrs. Hewitt. I need to see where it happened. She led me through a living room decorated with the kind of expensive good taste that probably required a professional, down a hallway lined with architectural drawings and expensive frames, to a study at the end. The door was open. You could see bookshelves, a leather chair, a mahogany desk, and a window that was currently closed but had clearly been the center of attention recently. This is where the police found him, she said quietly. Tuesday night, around 11, I'd been at a museum board meeting, got home at 10:30, found him on the floor, shot once in the chest, dead for at least an hour according to the medical examiner. I stepped into the room and looked around. The desk had been dusted. For fingerprints I could see the powder residue. The window was closed now, but when I examined it, I could see it opened easily enough. I stuck my head out and looked down. 4 floors to the sidewalk below, sheer wall, no fire escape, no ledge, no way up except through the front door, or maybe a very tall ladder and a death wish.
Oh my God.
The police think someone climbed up? I asked. They think someone opened the window from inside, my husband. Earlier in the day, and that the burglar somehow climbed up, got in, surprised my husband when he came into the study, and shot him. With what? They never found the gun. Whoever killed him took it with them. What was taken from the desk? Some cash, maybe $200? A silver letter opener, a gold pen set, his wallet from his jacket pocket. Small things, easy to carry, nothing too heavy or difficult to fence. Convenient, I said. That's what I thought. She moved to the desk and touched its surface lightly, like she was saying goodbye to something. My husband worked at this desk every evening. He'd come home from the office at 6, have dinner at 7, and then work here until 10 or 11. Every night. For 20 years. What was he working on Tuesday? A museum project? A Brennan Museum of Modern Art. He and Gerald had been working on it for 6 months, their biggest commission ever. $5 million for design work alone. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of responsibility. My husband took it very seriously. She opened a desk drawer. The police took some papers, contracts, blueprints, correspondence, but they left. These, she pulled out a stack of letters bound with a rubber band. I took them and flipped through personal correspondence, bills, invitations to gallery openings, and museum events. Anything unusual in his mail recently? Not that I noticed. But I didn't read his mail, Mr. Goodwin. I respected his privacy. What about threats? Angry clients? Business disputes? Nothing overt, though there was some tension about the museum. Project. What kind of tension? She hesitated. Gerald wanted to use a different construction firm than the one my husband preferred. They argued about it not violently, but persistently. Gerald said his firm was cheaper, more efficient. My husband said quality mattered more than cost. We're still negotiating when Richard died. Who won the argument? Neither of them. The museum board was supposed to make the final decision next week. And now? Now I suppose Gerald makes all the decisions himself. He's the sole principal of Hewitt and Morse architecture. She looked at me directly. Which gives him control of a $5 million project and $1 million inheritance. That's 6 million reasons to kill my husband, Mr. Goodwin. I couldn't argue with her math. Where can I find Gerald Morse? At the office, 5th Avenue, and 42nd Street, 20th floor. He's expecting why I called him this morning and told him you'd be coming. How did he take that? He said he'd be happy to help in any way he could. He sounded sincere. She paused, but then he always does. The offices of Hewitt and Morse Architecture occupied half the 20th floor of a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed straight lines were a sign of moral weakness. Everything curved: the walls, the ceiling, even the reception desk, behind which sat a young man with perfect hair and a smile that could have sold refrigerators to Eskimos. Archie Goodwin, to see Gerald Morse, I said. Of course, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Morse is expecting you. Picked up a phone, murmured into it, and then gestured down a hallway. Second door on the right. Gerald Morse's office was everything his partner's. Home study wasn't modern, sleek. It's full of chrome and glass, and the kind of furniture that looked uncomfortable, but probably cost a fortune. Morse himself was standing by the window when I came in, looking down at 5th Avenue like he owned it. He was mid-40s, tall, well-dressed in a way that suggested European tailors and careful attention to detail. When he turned to face me, his expression was perfectly calibrated to convey sympathy, concern, and professional competence in equal measure. Mr. Goodwin, thank you for coming. Please, sit down. He gestured to a chair that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated the human spine. I sat. I appreciate you taking the time, Mr. Morse. Of course. Marion told me she'd hired Nero Wolfe. I think that's why the police seem satisfied with their burglary theory. But Marion has delts. He sat across from me, crossing his legs carefully to preserve his trouser crease. How can I help? Tell me about Richard Hewitt. Richard was brilliant. One of the finest architects I've ever known. Perhaps the finest. He had a gift for understanding space, for seeing how buildings could shape human behavior and experience. We'd been partners for 20 years, and in that time, we never did anything that wasn't extraordinary. Were you friends? He considered. We were partners. That's different from friendship. Richard wasn't built for friendship. He was too focused, too intense. But we understood each other. We respected each other's talents. That was enough. I understand he changed his will recently. Morse's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or calculation? Told you about that? She did. Half his estate to you? $1 million. Yes. Richard told me about it 3 weeks ago. Said he wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, I'd have the resources to keep the firm running. To honor our work together, that was generous of him. It was typical of him. Richard planned everything, Mr. Goodwin. He thought 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. He wanted to ensure our legacy would survive him. Did he think something was going to happen to him? No more than any of us do. We're all mortal, Mr. Goodwin. Richard simply prepared for that inevitability. How convenient that he prepared just 3 weeks before someone shot him. Morse's jaw tightened. I understand why you'd think that. I'd think it too, in your position. But I didn't kill Richard, Mr. Goodwin. I had no reason to. You have a million reasons. Money isn't everything. Richard and I were on the verge of our greatest success, the Brennan Museum Commission. $5 million in design fees, with the potential for more commissions from the same family. We were going to be the most sought-after architectural firm in New York. Why would I throw that away to inherit money I didn't need? Maybe you wanted it all for yourself. If I wanted it all for myself, I'd have waited until after the museum was finished. Killing Richard now means I have to complete the project alone, without his genius to guide it. That's not an advantage. Mr. Goodwin, it's a disaster. He had a point. But then, clever killers always have points. Tell me about the museum project. Mrs. Hewitt mentioned some tension about construction firms. A minor disagreement. Richard wanted to use Kellerman Construction, expensive, slow but impeccable quality. I suggested Morrison & Sons half the cost, faster timeline, perfectly adequate quality. The museum board was going to decide next week, and now you get to decide. I get to carry the entire weight of a $5 million commission. Without my partner? He stood up and walked back to the window. Mr. Goodwin, I understand that I look like a suspect. I inherit money, I gain control of the firm, I benefit from Richard's death, but I'm telling you the truth, I didn't kill him. I couldn't have killed him, why not? Because I was in Boston Tuesday night. I took the 4 o'clock train, attended a dinner meeting with potential clients at the Ritz, and stayed overnight at the hotel. I didn't get back to New York until Wednesday afternoon. I have a dozen witnesses, train tickets, hotel receipts, whatever you need to verify it. I made notes. I'll need all of that, of course. My secretary has already prepared a file for you. He pressed a button on his desk. 30 seconds later, the young man from reception appeared with a manila folder, which he handed to me. With a smile that could have melted ice in January, I flipped through its train tickets. Hotel receipt, a list of names and phone numbers for the dinner guests. If it was fake, it was a very good fake. Mr. Morse, one more question. Who else had access to the Hewitt apartment? Access? You mean keys? Keys, knowledge of the layout, familiarity with their routine? He thought about it. Marion, obviously. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Chun-Shi, comes 3 days a week. Their building. Superintendent and me. I looked up. You had a key? Richard and I exchanged keys years ago, in case of emergency. We both traveled frequently. It was practical to have someone who could check on things if needed. I've probably used it twice. In 20 years, always with permission. Where's your key now? In my desk drawer at home, where it's been for the past 6 months. He met my eyes. I didn't use it Tuesday night, Mr. Goodwin. I was in Boston. Then who did? That, he said quietly, is what you need to find out. Got back to the brownstone at 1:15. Just as Wolfe was finishing his lunch, broiled lobster tails with drawn butter, if the smell from the dining room was any indication. He was in his chair in the office when I walked in, working on his second bottle of beer and looking like a man who'd just solved a particularly satisfying equation. Well, he said, I gave him the full report, the apartment, the impossible window, Marion Hewitt's conviction that her husband was murdered, Gerald Morse's alibi and his $1 million inheritance, the museum project worth $5 million more. When I finished, Wolfe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Archie, what troubled you about Mr. Morse? Besides the fact that he benefits enormously from his partner's death? Besides that, what did you observe? I thought about it. He was too smooth, too prepared. He had answers for everything. The will, the alibi, the key, the museum project. It felt rehearsed. Precisely. Mr. Morse is a man who plans things carefully. An architect, after all, does nothing without careful planning, which raises an interesting question. What question? If Mr. Morse killed Richard Hewitt, why would he do it in a way that immediately draws suspicion to himself? Why change the will 3 weeks before the murder? Why ensure that he inherits exactly when it looks most suspicious? Why not wait 6 months, a year, until the connection is less obvious? Maybe he couldn't wait. Maybe he needed the money now. A man who designs $5 million museums does not need $1 million immediately. and a man intelligent. Enough to design such museums as intelligent enough to wait for a better opportunity. Wolfe poured beer. No, Archie. If Gerald Morse killed Richard Hewitt, he did it knowing that he would be suspected. Which means either he's supremely confident in his alibi, or he's supremely confident that we'll waste our time suspecting him while the real killer escapes notice. You think he's being framed? I think someone wants us to think he killed Richard Hewitt. Whether that someone is Gerald Morse, himself creating an obvious suspect to distract from his guilt, or someone else entirely, remains to be determined. He leaned back. Tomorrow you will speak with Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper. I want to know who had access to that apartment, who knew Richard Hewitt's routine, who might have been there Tuesday night. I also want you to verify Mr. Morse's alibi. Call the hotel, call the dinner guests, confirm that he was indeed in Boston. And if his alibi holds, then we'll know that either he hired someone to kill Richard Hewitt, or someone else killed Richard Hewitt and carefully arranged matters to implicate Mr. Morse. He closed his eyes. Either way, Archie, someone planned this murder very carefully. Everything went according to plan. So what's the problem? The problem is that when everything goes according to plan, it usually means the plan was too obvious. And obvious plans, in my experience, are designed to hide something else entirely. He picked up his book and dismissed me with a wave. I went to my desk and started making phone calls. Somewhere in Boston, a hotel clerk was about to tell me whether Gerald Morse had really been there Tuesday night. And somewhere in New York, a killer was congratulating themselves on a plan that had worked perfectly. Too perfectly, according to Wolfe. Which meant somewhere, somehow, something had gone wrong. We just had to figure out what. The hotel in Boston confirmed that. Gerald Morse had checked in Tuesday at 6:47 p.m. Checked out Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. The restaurant at the Ritz confirmed he'd hosted a dinner party of 6 from 8 to 11 Tuesday night. 3 of the dinner guests confirmed the same thing when I called them. Gerald Morse's alibi was solid as granite and twice as heavy, which meant either he'd hired someone to kill Richard Hewitt, or someone else had done it and gone too considerable. Trouble to make Morse look like the obvious suspect. Friday morning, I was back at the Hewitt apartment. It's time to talk to Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper. She was a small, efficient woman in her 60s who moved through the apartment like she was conducting an orchestra. Every gesture precise, every movement purposeful. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you about Tuesday. I wasn't here Tuesday. I come Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Always the same days, same times. 8 to 4. So you weren't here when Mr. Hewitt was killed? No, I learned about it Wednesday morning when I arrived. Mrs. Hewitt told me. Very sad. She continued folding towels with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Mr. Hewitt was a good man. Difficult, but good. Difficult how? Particular. Everything had to be just so, books arranged by height, papers squared on his desk, windows closed and locked before bed. Every night, same routine. 9:30, he would walk through apartment, check every window, every door, then work and study. Until 10:30, 11? Very regular. Did he check the windows Tuesday night? I wasn't here Tuesday night, Mr. Goodwin, but if Mr. Hewitt was home, he checked windows. He always checked windows. Who else has keys to this apartment? Mrs. Hewitt, building superintendent. Mr. Moore is Mr. Hewitt's partner. And me. Where do you keep your key? In my purse. Always in my purse? Could anyone have borrowed it? She stopped folding and looked at me like I'd suggested she might have wings hidden under her cardigan. Who would borrow my key? And when? I work here 3 days. I work to other places other days. My key is with me always. What about the building superintendent, Mr. Walsh? He has master key for emergencies. I've seen him use it twice in 5 years, once when Mrs. Hewitt locked herself out, once when pipe burst in wall. He doesn't come unless called. And Gerald Morse. Mr. Morse came here maybe twice a year. Always with Mr. Hewitt. Always for business. He would work and study. I would bring them coffee. That's all. When was the last time you saw Mr. Morse here? She thought about it. June, maybe July. They were reviewing blueprints for museum. Mr. Morse stayed 2 hours, then left. Did Mr. Hewitt have any visitors Tuesday? I told you I wasn't here Tuesday. What about Monday? Or recently? Monday was normal. I arrived at 8, cleaned, did laundry, made lunch for Mr. Hewitt. He ate, went to office. Mrs. Hewitt was at museum all day. No visitors. What about the week before? Any unusual visitors? Phone calls? Deliveries? No visitors? Some phone calls? Always business? One delivery Wednesday before last. What kind of delivery? Package from art supply store. She paints watercolors. Very beautiful. I made notes, though I couldn't see how art supplies connected to murder. Mrs. Chen, did Mr. Hewitt seem worried about anything recently? Anxious? Afraid? Mr. Hewitt was always anxious. That was his nature. But more than usual, she considered. Maybe last few weeks he was quieter, more in his head. But he didn't talk to me about worries. He talked to Mrs. Hewitt. Did he and Mrs. Hewitt get along? They were married 40 years, Mr. Goodwin? They got along the way people married 40 years get along sometimes? Yes? Sometimes no. Mostly they understood each other. I thanked her and went to find Marion Hewitt, who was in what she called her Studio A sun-filled room with an easel, paints, and half-finished watercolors of flowers that looked like they'd been painted by someone with actual talent. Mrs. Hewitt, Mrs. Chen mentioned your husband seemed preoccupied recently. Quieter than usual. She put down her brush. Yes, the museum project was weighing on him. The Brennan family is very demanding. They want perfection, and they want it quickly. Those two things don't always coexist peacefully. Was there tension with the clients? Some. Evelyn Brennan, the family matriarch, kept changing her mind about design elements. My husband would create something. She'd approve it. Then 2 weeks later, she'd want it changed. Could she have been angry enough to kill him? Marion actually laughed. Evelyn Brennan is 78 years old, weighs 90 pounds, and hasn't left her mansion in Oyster Bay in 10 years. I doubt she could climb the stairs to this apartment, let alone shoot someone. What about other members of the family? Her son Marcus handles the business side of things. It's been perfectly professional. And her grandson David is an art dealer who couldn't care less about museums. Neither of them had any reason to kill Richard. Someone had a reason. Yes, she picked up her brush again, but didn't paint. Mr. Goodwin, I keep thinking about that window. It's been driving me mad. Richard would never have left it open. Never. Which means someone opened it after they killed him to make it look like a burglary. But why? If you're going to kill someone and stage a burglary, why do it so obviously? Why open a window on the 4th floor that no one could possibly have climbed through? It's almost like ... double quotes. It's almost like they wanted us to know it wasn't really a burglary. I thought about what Wolfe had said about plans being too obvious, about careful arrangements designed to hide something else. Mrs. Hewitt, who benefits from your husband's death besides Gerald Morse? No one. His estate comes to me, except for the portion that goes to Gerald. The firm passes to Gerald's control. Everything else is reputation, his work, his legacy, that stays with the buildings he designed. What about insurance? We have life insurance, of course. $1 million. It comes to me, and if you were to die, it goes to charity, a foundation Richard established for architectural education. She looked at me directly. Mr. Goodwin, if you're thinking I killed my husband for insurance money, you're wasting your time. I didn't need his money. I have my own money. My family was quite wealthy. I married Richard because I loved him, not because I needed financial security. I'm not accusing you, Mrs. Hewitt. I'm just trying to understand who benefits. And understand this. The only person who benefits significantly is Gerald Morse. And according to you, he was in Boston when Richard was killed. According to everyone. In Boston? Yes. Then either he hired someone, or... She trailed off. Or what? Or we're looking at this the wrong way. What if the point wasn't to kill Richard? What if the point was something else, and killing Richard was just the means to that end? It was a good question. I wished I had a good answer. I got back to the brownstone at 3:30 to find Inspector Kramer sitting in the red leather chair. smoking a cigar and looking like he'd bitten into something sour and couldn't decide whether to spit it out or swallow it. "Goodwin," he said when I walked in. "Where's Wolfe?" "With his orchids, he'll be down at 6. I'll wait. Suit yourself." "What brings you here?" He blew smoke at the ceiling. "Marion Hewitt. She called me this morning, said she'd hired Wolfe to investigate her husband's murder, said we'd made a mistake calling it a burglary. And I'm here to tell Wolfe that we didn't make a mistake." Richard Hewitt was killed by a burglar who got in through the study window, surprised Hewitt, shot him, and fled with his wallet and some valuables. It's unfortunate, it's tragic, but it's not complicated. Except for the window being on the 4th floor, with no way to reach it from outside. Kramer's cigar paused halfway to his mouth. "What? The window? There's no fire? Escape. No ledge, no way up, except maybe a very tall ladder and a death wish. Which means the burglar had to be already inside the apartment when they opened it. Hewitt must have opened it himself earlier. Richard Hewitt checked every window in his apartment every single night at 9:30. His housekeeper confirmed it, said he was obsessive about it. The idea that he'd leave that window open is about as likely as you forgetting to smoke a cigar." Kramer's jaw tightened. "So what are you saying? That someone killed him and staged a burglary?" "I'm saying that's what the evidence suggests."
That's...
"What we're trying to figure out, Gerald Morse inherits $1 million in control of the firm, but he was in Boston with a dozen witnesses. So either he hired someone, or someone else did it, and is happy to let Morse take the suspicion. Or maybe Hewitt really did leave the window open, and you're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "Maybe, but Wolfe doesn't think so. And when Wolfe doesn't think so, it usually means there's something worth thinking about." Kramer smoked in silence for a minute. Then he said, "All right, I'll look at it again. But Goodwin, if this turns out to be what it looks like, a simple burglary, I'm going to be very annoyed." "You're always annoyed. It's your natural state." "Okay, yeah, well, this time I'll be annoyed and right." At 6 o'clock precisely, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms and stopped short when he saw Kramer in his office. "Inspector, what an unexpected displeasure, Wolfe. We need to talk about Richard Hewitt." Wolfe settled into his chair with the careful precision of an ocean liner docking. "There's nothing to discuss. Mr. Hewitt was murdered. The police called it a burglary. Mrs. Hewitt hired me to prove otherwise. A simple arrangement. Not so simple if you're wrong." "I'm rarely wrong, Inspector. It's one of my few consistent qualities." Kramer leaned forward. "Wolfe, I've known you for 20 years. I know how you work. You take a case, you decide the police are wrong, and then you twist the evidence until it fits your theory. But this time, the evidence doesn't twist. Richard Hewitt was killed by a burglar. Accept it and move on. We'll accept it when the evidence supports it. Currently, it does not. What evidence?" "The window, Inspector. A 4th-floor window with no external access. Either Mr. Hewitt opened it himself, which contradicts his established patterns of behavior, or someone else opened it after killing him. If someone else opened it, then we're looking at a staged burglary. And staged burglaries imply premeditation, planning, and purpose. Or maybe Hewitt was getting older and forgot to close the damn window." Mr. Hewitt was 58 years old, in excellent health, and according to everyone who knew him, was meticulous to the point of obsession. He didn't forget things, Inspector. He planned things. People change. People die, Inspector. And when? They die suspiciously. It's our job to determine why." Wolfe poured beer. "I suggest you re-examine the crime scene. Check for evidence that doesn't fit the burglary narrative. And consider the possibility that you've been deceived by someone who planned this very carefully. And if I find nothing, then I'll have wasted Mrs. Hewitt's money and your time. But I suspect you'll find something, Inspector. Something small, something overlooked, something that proves this was murder disguised as burglary." Kramer stood. "Up. I'll look. But Wolfe, if you're wrong about this, I'm going to enjoy watching you eat crow." "I never eat crow, Inspector. It's too stringy. Now, if you'll excuse me, Fritz is preparing shad roe for dinner, and I need to prepare myself mentally for the experience." After Kramer left, Wolfe sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Archie, what did Mrs. Hewitt tell you about the window?" "That her husband would never have left it open, that someone must have opened it after they killed him." And what did she say about who benefits from his death? Gerald Morse gets $1 million in the firm. She gets life insurance. And the estate? Nobody else benefits significantly. Except Wolfe said slowly, "That's not quite true, is it?" "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Hewitt told you her husband changed his will 3 weeks ago. Previously, everything went to her. Now half goes to Gerald Morse, which means Mrs. Hewitt lost approximately $1 million because of that change. So consider this. If Richard Hewitt had died 4 weeks ago, before he changed his will, Mrs. Hewitt would have inherited everything $2 million plus the firm. But he died 3 weeks after changing the will, which means she only inherits half. A loss of $1 million? You think she killed him? I think someone had a reason to want Richard Hewitt dead before he changed his will, and that reason disappeared after he changed it. The question is, who knew about the will change, and who stood to lose by it? Marion Hewitt knew, did she? Or did she only learn about it after her husband died when the lawyer called? Wolfe leaned back. "Archie, tomorrow I want you to speak with Richard Hewitt's lawyer. Find out when the will was changed, who knew about it, and whether anyone tried to prevent it. I also want you to verify the timeline. When exactly did Hewitt die? When did his wife discover the body? And how long between death and discovery? You think Marion Hewitt killed her husband?" "I think someone planned this very carefully, Archie. Careful plans require careful timing. If the timing is wrong, the whole plan falls apart." He picked up his book and dismissed me with a wave. I sat at my desk and thought about Marion Hewitt, her grief, her conviction that her husband had been murdered, her certainty about the open window. Either she was telling the truth and someone had killed Richard Hewitt and staged a burglary, or she was lying and she'd killed him herself and was using us to throw suspicion elsewhere. Either way, Wolfe was right about one thing. Everything had gone according to plan. The question was, whose plan? Saturday morning I visited the law offices of Peterson, Carmichael and Rhodes on Lexington Avenue, where Richard Hewitt's lawyer worked in a corner office with a view of the Chrysler Building and furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. Harold Carmichael was 70 if he was a day, with white hair, shrewd eyes, and the kind of voice that suggested he'd spent 50 years telling people uncomfortable truths and charging them handsomely for the privilege. "Mr. Goodwin, Marion said you'd be calling. Terrible business about Richard. Absolutely terrible." He gestured to a chair. "How can I help? I need to know about Richard Hewitt's will, when it was changed, why it was changed, and who knew about it." "The will was changed on September 5th. Richard came to me, said he wanted to revise his estate plan. Previously, everything went to Marion, approximately $2 million in assets, plus his share of the architectural firm. The new will splits the estate. Marion gets $1 million plus the house and personal property. Gerald Morse gets $1 million plus Richard's share of the firm." "Did he say why?" "He said Gerald had been his partner for 20 years, that their work together was the most important thing in his life, and that he wanted to ensure Gerald could continue their legacy if anything happened to him." "How did Marion react?" "Marion didn't know. Richard specifically asked me not to tell her until after his death. Said she'd argue with him about it, try to change his mind, and he didn't want the conflict. So she had no idea she was losing $1 million. Not until I called her Wednesday morning to discuss funeral arrangements and estate matters." Carmichael leaned back. "Mr. Goodwin, I've known Marion Hewitt for 20 years. She's a smart woman, a strong woman, but she's not a killer. She loved Richard, despite his difficult personality. The idea that she'd murder him over money she didn't even know she was losing is absurd, unless she did know. I didn't tell her. Richard didn't tell her. So unless she broke into my office and read confidential documents, which she didn't, there's no way she could have known." "Oh." "What about Gerald Morse? Did he know? Richard told him the same day he signed the will, September 5th. Gerald came to Richard's office. They had a meeting, and Richard informed him of the change. How did Gerald react? According to Richard, Gerald was surprised but grateful. Said it was generous and unnecessary, but that he'd honor Richard's wishes. Did Gerald know Richard was keeping it secret from Marion? I don't know. You'd have to ask him. I made notes. Mr. Carmichael, one more question. Who else benefits from Richard Hewitt's death? No one directly. The will is simple. Marion and Gerald split the estate, with a few small bequests to charities and organizations. The firm passes to Gerald's control, subject to partnership agreements. Everything else, royalties from published works, residuals. From completed projects, those continue as specified in existing contracts. What about life insurance? $1 million? Payable to Marion? Standard policy? Been in place for 15 years? So Marion gets $1 million from the estate plus $1 million from insurance. That's $2 million total. Which is exactly what she would have gotten under the old will, except it would have all been estate money. The insurance was always separate. Under the old will, she'd also have gotten Richard's share of the firm. True. Which is worth? Well, it's hard to say. The firm's value depends on future commissions, ongoing projects, reputation. Could be worth another $1 million. Could be worth $5 million in the long run. Gerald Morse certainly gained control of something valuable. I thanked him and left, thinking about timelines and who knew what when. Richard changed his will on September 5th. He died September 26th, 3 weeks later. Marion didn't know about the change until after his death. Gerald knew immediately, which meant if Marion killed Richard, she did it not knowing she was losing $1 million. If Gerald killed Richard, he did it knowing he'd immediately become the obvious suspect. Neither scenario made sense, unless someone else had known about the will change, someone who stood to benefit from Richard's death, and who knew exactly when to act. I spent Saturday afternoon tracking down the building superintendent at the Hewitt apartment, a man named Walsh, who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts left over from other, more successful building superintendents. Yeah, I got a master key, he said when I found him in the basement, working on a furnace that looked older than the building. Use it for emergencies. Burst pipes, gas leaks, that kind of thing. Ever use it for the Hewitt apartment? Once. Maybe 2 years ago, Mrs. Hewitt locked herself out. I let her in. That's it. Where do you keep the key? He gestured to a key cabinet on the wall, locked, but the kind of lock a determined 10-year-old could pick with a hairpin. In there? With all the other master keys? Is it always locked? Supposed to be. But sometimes I forget. I'm busy, you know? Can't be everywhere at once. So, someone could have borrowed the key without you knowing? I guess. But why would they? To commit murder, Mr. Walsh. To get into the Hewitt apartment and kill Richard Hewitt. He dropped his wrench. You think someone took my key? I think it's possible. When was the last time you checked the key cabinet? I don't know, a week ago? 2 weeks? You'd notice if a key was missing? Maybe. Probably. I mean, I know it's supposed to be there. Check now. See if any keys are missing. He opened the cabinet and started counting. 30 seconds later. He looked up at me with the expression of a man who'd just realized he might be unemployed by Monday. The Hewitt key. It's gone. When did you last see it? I don't know. Like I said, 2 weeks ago maybe. It could be longer. Who has access to? This basement? Residents? Delivery people? Repair guys? Anyone who lives in the building can come down here. Doors not locked during the day. So anyone in the building could have taken the key. Yeah, I guess. Jesus. Mrs. Hewitt's going to kill me. I left him having a minor existential crisis and went back upstairs to think. The missing key changed everything. It meant whoever killed Richard Hewitt had planned it carefully, had stolen the master key. Waited for the right moment, entered the apartment, killed Richard, staged the burglary, and left through the front door. It also meant it could have been anyone in the building, or anyone who'd visited the building and had access to the basement, which was approximately everyone in Manhattan Sunday morning. Wolfe was in a foul mood. It was raining, which meant his orchids were unhappy. Fritz had burned the bacon at breakfast, which meant Wolfe was unhappy. And I'd reported that we now had no solid suspects, which meant I was about to be very unhappy. Archie, he said, after I'd finished my report on the missing key, summarize what we know. I flipped open my notebook. Richard Hewitt was shot Tuesday night in his study. The police think it was a burglary, but the open window on the 4th floor suggests it was staged. Richard changed his will 3 weeks before his death, leaving half his estate to Gerald Morse. Marion didn't know about the change. Gerald did. The building superintendent's master key is missing, which means anyone could have entered the apartment. Gerald Morse has an ironclad alibi in Boston. Marion Hewitt has no alibis. He was at a museum board meeting until 10:30, found the body around 11. Medical examiner puts time of death between 9 and 10, which means Mrs. Hewitt could have killed her husband. If she left the museum meeting early, yes. But why would she? She didn't know about the will change. Unless she did know. Unless Richard told her, despite asking his lawyer to keep it secret. Unless they fought about it and she killed him in anger. Wolfe poured beer. Or unless she had some other reason to want him dead. A reason that has nothing to do with money. Like what? Like freedom. Like resentment. Like 40 years of marriage to a difficult, obsessive, demanding man who checked windows and planned everything and left no room for spontaneity or joy. He drank. Money is not the only motive for murder, Archie. Sometimes people kill because they simply cannot bear their lives any longer. That's pretty dark, even for you. Murder is dark, Archie. That's why we investigate it. The phone rang. I answered it. Goodwin. It's Kramer. Tell Wolfe we found something at the Hewitt apartment. What? A fingerprint on the study window frame. Doesn't match Richard Hewitt, doesn't match Marion Hewitt, doesn't match the housekeeper or the superintendent. Whose is it? That's the interesting part. It matches David Brennan. Who's David Brennan? The grandson of Evelyn Brennan. The family that's paying for the museum Richard Hewitt was designing. The family that's paying $5 million for the project. I felt something click into place. Why would David Brennan's fingerprints be in Richard Hewitt's study? That's what I'm going to ask him. He's coming in for questioning this afternoon. Thought Wolfe would want to know. He does. Thanks, Inspector. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. David Brennan, the Brennan family grandson. His fingerprints are on the window frame. Wolfe's eyes opened wide. Indeed. And what do we know about David Brennan? Marion Hewitt mentioned him, said he's an art dealer who doesn't care about museums. She didn't think he had any reason to kill Richard. Then she was wrong. Because David Brennan's fingerprints in that study suggest he cared very much about something in that room. The question is what? He leaned forward. Archie, call Marion Hewitt. Ask her about David Brennan. I want to know his relationship with her husband, whether they'd met before, and what business, if any, they had together. I called. Marion answered on the second ring. This is Hewitt. It's Archie Goodwin. I need to ask you about David Brennan, David. What about him? Did he know your husband? Ever visit your apartment? Not that I'm aware of. David's involved in the art world, galleries, auctions, that sort of thing. Richard designed buildings. I can't imagine what connection they'd have. Police found his fingerprints in your husband's study. On the window frame. Silence. Then, that's impossible. David was never in our apartment. I'd have known. Unless he visited when you weren't there. Why would he visit? For what purpose? It's what we're trying to find out. Mrs. Hewitt, what? Do you know about David Brennan? Not much. He's Evelyn's grandson, her son Marcus's boy. Late 20s, runs a gallery in Soho. I've met him twice, both times at Brennan family events. Seemed pleasant, but uninterested in the museum project. Said architecture bored him. What about his relationship with his family, with his grandmother, Evelyn? Adores him. He's her favorite grandchild. The artistic one. The sensitive one. Marcus is all business, but David has the creative temperament Evelyn appreciates. Does David stand to inherit from Evelyn? I assume so. What the Brennans are worth. I don't know, 50 million? 100 million? More. David will certainly get a substantial inheritance eventually. Eventually? But what if he needed money now? Another silence. Mr. Goodwin, are you suggesting David killed Richard for money? I'm suggesting his fingerprints are in your husband's study, which means he was there at some point. And if he was there, he had a reason. I'm just trying to figure out what it was, and I suggest you ask him. She hung up. Wolfe had been listening. To my end of the conversation, when I put the phone down, he said, Archie, David Brennan is either a killer or a witness. We need to determine which. When Inspector Kramer finishes questioning him, I want you to speak with him. Find out why he was in that study, what his relationship with Richard Hewitt was, and whether he had any reason, financial or otherwise, to want Richard dead. And if Kramer arrests him first, then we'll visit him in jail. I'm beginning to. Suspect, Archie, that Richard Hewitt's murder has very little to do with wills or insurance or partnerships, and everything to do with something we haven't yet discovered. Something that connects David Brennan to Richard Hewitt in a way that isn't obvious. Like what? Like art, perhaps? Or money? Or secrets that needed to remain hidden? Picked up his book. Find David Brennan, Archie. Find out what secret. He was protecting when he entered that study and opened that window. Inspector Kramer called at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Goodwin, tell Wolfe his art dealer theory just fell apart. What happened? David Brennan has an alibi. Tuesday night, he was at an opening at his gallery in Soho. 50 witnesses, including 2 reporters from the Times. He was there from 7 until midnight. Couldn't have killed Richard Hewitt. And why were his fingerprints in Hewitt's study? Says he visited Hewitt 3 weeks ago, September 5th, same day Hewitt changed his will, coincidentally. Brennan wanted to discuss some artwork for the museum. Prochik said his grandmother had commissioned several pieces and wanted Hewitt's opinion on placement. They met in the study, looked at some sketches, and Brennan left after an hour. Says he must have touched the window while looking out at the view. How did Hewitt confirm this meeting? Can't ask a dead man, Goodwin. But Brennan's story checks out. His grandmother confirms she sent him to discuss artwork. And Hewitt's calendar has a meeting with D. Brennan at 4 p.m. on September 5th. September 5th. The same day Hewitt changed his will. Yeah, noticed. That myself. But Brennan didn't know about the will, says. He'd never met Gerald Morse. Didn't know anything about Hewitt's business arrangements. He was there about art, nothing else. You believe him? His alibi's solid, and he has no motive. His grandmother's worth $100 million. He doesn't need to kill architects for money. Maybe it wasn't about money. Then what was it? About art? Kramer's voice dripped skepticism. Look, Goodwin, I've investigated this from every angle. Richard Hewitt was killed by a burglar who got lucky with a stolen key. Marion Hewitt's grief is making her see conspiracies where theirs. Only bad luck. Tell Wolfe to drop it and let the professionals handle it. The professionals who thought it was a burglary through a 4th-floor window? The professionals who are reopening the case and looking for whoever took that master key. We'll find them, Goodwin. Just takes time. He hung up, I reported to Wolfe, who listened with his eyes closed and his fingers interlaced. September 5th, he said when I finished. David Brennan visits Richard Hewitt on September 5th. And on September 5th, Richard Hewitt changes his will. That is not coincidence, Archie. Kramer thinks it is. Inspector Kramer thinks many things. He's occasionally correct, but more often he is merely thorough. Wolfe opened his eyes. What reason did David Brennan give for his visit? To discuss artwork for the museum. His grandmother commissioned pieces and wanted Hewitt's opinion, and this required a personal visit to Hewitt's home rather than a meeting at the office. Apparently. Interesting, most interesting. He leaned back. Archie, tomorrow, I want you to visit David Brennan's gallery. Look at his artwork, assess his business, and determine whether a man who deals in art has any reason to kill an architect. Besides the obvious connection through his grandmother's museum project, besides that, as I suspect there is another connection, something that has nothing to do with museums or families or architectural commissions, something that Richard Hewitt discovered on September 5th, the day David Brennan visited him, the day he changed his will. You think Hewitt changed his will because of something Brennan told him? I think Richard Hewitt was a meticulous planner who did nothing without reason. If he changed his will on September 5th, something happened on September 5th to prompt that change. The question is what? The phone rang again. This time it was Marion Hewitt, and her voice had the brittle quality of someone who'd been crying and was trying very hard not to start again. Mr. Goodwin, I remembered something about David Brennan's visit. What? Richard mentioned it at dinner that night, September 5th. He said David had visited, that they'd discussed some artwork, and that David was surprisingly knowledgeable. About Chinese antiquities? Chinese antiquities? I thought Brennan dealt in modern art. He does. That's why it struck me as odd. Richard said David had recognized a piece in his study, a small jade sculpture that Richard had inherited from his father. David knew its provenance, its age, even its approximate value. Richard was impressed. Where's this jade sculpture now? In the study. On the bookshelf. The police inventoried it. Wasn't taken during the burglary. Can I see it? Of course. Come tomorrow morning. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. Chinese jade sculpture. David Brennan knew all about it, and it's still in the study, wasn't taken during the burglary. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Then it wasn't valuable enough to steal, or it was too recognizable defense. Or he paused. Or it was never the target of the theft. What do you mean? Think Archie. Burglar breaks into an apartment, finds $200 in cash, a gold pen, a silver letter opener, a wallet, all easily portable, easily sold. But he doesn't take a jade sculpture that even a casual art enthusiast like David Brennan recognizes as valuable. Maybe he didn't know it was valuable. Or maybe he wasn't interested in jade sculptures. Maybe he was interested in something else entirely. Something that was in that study on September 5th when David Brennan visited, but wasn't there on September 26th when Richard Hewitt died. Like what? Like documents? Like papers? Like something that Richard Hewitt kept in his study and that someone wanted badly enough to commit murder to obtain. Wolfe poured beer. Tomorrow, Archie, you will visit Marion Hewitt and examine that study carefully. I want to know what's missing, what papers Richard Hewitt kept there, what documents he was working on, what might have been stolen that didn't appear on the police inventory of the burglary. The police already searched the study. Police were looking for evidence of burglary. They found what they expected to find: cash missing, valuables stolen, a window open. They weren't looking for missing documents because they weren't looking for murder. But we are. Monday morning, I was back at the Hewitt apartment, standing in Richard Hewitt's study with Marion Hewitt and trying to figure out what wasn't there. His filing cabinet, Marion said, opening it. Personal correspondence, business papers, contracts, everything organized alphabetically. Richard was fanatical about organization. I flipped through. Letters from clients, contracts with suppliers, correspondence with city officials about permits and zoning. Everything labeled, everything filed, everything exactly where it should be. What about works in progress? Projects he was designing? Those would be in his office at the firm. Kept copies here sometimes, but the originals were always at the office. What about financial records? In the filing cabinet, under F-Tax. Returns, bank statements, investment records, all there. I moved to the desk. It's 3 drawers on each side, plus a center drawer. I opened them systematically. Pens, paper, stamps, envelopes. A checkbook with recent entries, nothing unusual. Some loose change, business cards, a small notebook with measurements and sketches. Double quotes Mrs. Hewitt. What did your husband keep on his desk? When you saw it last, before he died, what was there? She thought. Papers. Always papers. The museum project blueprints, usually his calendar. A manuscript he was reading. Someone had asked him to write a foreword for a book on modern architecture. Where's the manuscript now? I don't know. The police took some papers. Maybe they have it. I called Kramer. Inspector, did you take a manuscript from Hewitt's study? Book on modern architecture? Hold on. I heard rustling. Yeah, we took it. Why? Was there anything unusual about it? It was a manuscript about buildings. Very boring. We returned it to the publisher last week. They wanted it back. Which? Publisher Madison House. On Madison Avenue. Why, just checking. Thanks, Inspector. I hung up and looked at Marion. The police took the manuscript, returned it to the publisher. What else was on the desk? His calendar? The police took that. 2. What about the jade sculpture? Where is it? She pointed to the bookshelf. On the middle shelf, between 2 books on architectural theory, sat a small jade sculpture, maybe 6 inches tall, carved in the shape of a dragon. Green with white inclusions, sitting on a wooden base. I picked it up carefully. It was heavier than it looked, cool to the touch, intricately carved. On the wooden base was a small brass plaque. Eastern Han Dynasty. Circa 100 CE gift of James Hewitt to Richard Hewitt. 1938. Richard's father gave it to him, Marion said. His most prized possession. Kept it on his desk for years then. Moved it to the bookshelf when he ran out of space. David Brennan knew about this sculpture. Apparently, according to Richard, David recognized it immediately, knew its history. Even mentioned that pieces like this had been selling at auction for significant sums. How significant? Richard said David mentioned a similar piece sold for $50,000 last year. I set the sculpture down carefully. $50,000 sitting on a bookshelf, and the burglar didn't take it.
Which meant either
The burglar was stupid, or the burglary wasn't real, or the burglar was looking for something else entirely. Mrs. Hewitt, did your husband keep anything else valuable in this study? Besides the sculpture? Some first edition books? His father's? Pocket watch. A few pieces of art, but nothing worth killing for. What about information? Documents that might be valuable to someone? Like what? Like architectural plans? Like confidential client information? It's like anything someone might want badly enough to steal. She shook her head. Richard's work was all at the office. He brought copies home sometimes, but nothing that wasn't already filed with the city or the clients. I was missing something. Something obvious. Something that connected David Brennan's visit on September 5th. Richard Hewitt's will change. On September 5th, and his murder on September 26th, then I saw it. On the bookshelf, next to where the jade sculpture sat, was a gap. A space where another book should have been, judging by the dust patterns. Mrs. Hewitt, was there a book here? Next to the sculpture? She looked. Yes, Richard's journal. He kept a personal journal, a diary. Exactly, but notes on projects, ideas, observations. He wrote in it every evening. Where is it now? I don't know. I assumed the police took it. I called Kramer again. Inspector, did you take a journal from Hewitt's study? Personal journal? Probably leather-bound? No. We took papers, blueprints, his calendar, the manuscript. No journal. You're sure? I've got the inventory right here. No journal listed. Then it's missing. Missing or misplaced. Hewitt could have taken it to his office, left it somewhere else, or the killer took it. Why would a burglar take a journal? Because he wasn't a burglar, Inspector. He was a killer who wanted whatever was in that journal badly enough to murder Richard Hewitt and stage a burglary to cover it up. I hung up and looked at Wolfe, who I'd called on Marion's phone and put on speaker. A journal, Wolfe said from the brownstone, his voice crackling through the phone line. A personal journal that was on the bookshelf on September 5th when David Brennan visited, but is missing now. That Archie is our tiny clue. That is what we've been looking for. What was in the journal? Something that Richard Hewitt wrote on or after September 5th? Something about David Brennan? Or about what David told him? Or about what he discovered after David's visit? Something important enough that someone killed him for it and stole it to prevent anyone else from reading it. How do we find out what it said? We asked the one person who might know. We asked David Brennan what he and Richard Hewitt discussed. On September 5th, we watched very carefully to see whether he tells us the truth. David Brennan's gallery in Soho occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse with white walls, polished concrete floors, and the kind of lighting that made everything look either brilliant or pretentious depending on your perspective. The art on the walls was abstract splashes of color that probably meant something profound to people who understood these things and looked like spilled paint to everyone else. Brennan himself was in the back office when I arrived Monday afternoon. Young man in his late 20s, with dark hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of cultivated sophistication that suggested either genuine education or very good acting lessons. When I introduced myself, his smile was polite but wary. Mr. Goodwin, the police said you might come by. Something about Mr. Hewitt's murder? Something about your visit to his apartment on September 5th? The smile didn't waver. I already explained that to Inspector Kramer. My grandmother commissioned some artwork for the museum Chinese pieces, mostly to complement the architecture. She wanted Mr. Hewitt's opinion on placement and scale. We met at his apartment, discussed the pieces, and I left. Simple as that. Simple. Except Richard Hewitt changed his will that same day. Did he? I wouldn't know. We didn't discuss his will. What did you discuss? Besides artwork? Architecture, mostly. Mr. Hewitt was passionate about his work. He showed me the museum designs. explained his philosophy of space and light. It was actually quite fascinating. And the jade sculpture? Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Maybe, or calculation. The dragon? Yes, beautiful piece. Eastern Han Dynasty, if I remember correctly. It's worth quite a bit, actually. I mentioned that similar pieces had been selling well at auction. $50,000, according to Mrs. Hewitt, approximately. The market for Chinese antiquities has been strong recently. I walked around the gallery, pretending to look at the art, while actually watching Brennan's reflection in the glass. Mr. Brennan, what do you know about Richard Hewitt's journal? His journal? Personal journal? Kept it on a bookshelf in his study. It's missing now. Oh, I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about a journal. I didn't even know he kept one. Yeah, but you were in his study. You saw his bookshelf. I saw a lot of things, Mr. Goodwin. I don't catalog every object in every room I visit. You catalog the jade sculpture, knew its dynasty, its value, its auction history. I'm an art dealer. Chinese antiquities are part of my business. Of course I noticed it, but not the journal sitting right next to it. I don't recall seeing a journal. Perhaps it was already gone when I visited. Perhaps Mr. Hewitt kept it somewhere else. Perhaps it wasn't there at all. It was good. Calm, composed, with answers ready for every question. So ready, maybe? Like Gerald Morse had been. Like someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in advance. Mr. Brennan, why did you really visit Richard Hewitt on September 5th? Discuss artwork for my grandmother's museum. That required a personal visit to his home rather than a meeting at his office. Mr. Hewitt suggested his home, said he had references and materials there that would be useful. One merely accommodated his preference. References about Chinese art, about museum design and artwork integration. His expertise, not mine. I turned to face him directly. Mr. Brennan, Richard Hewitt is dead. Someone shot him, stole his journal, and staged a burglary to cover it up. If you know something about why that happened, now would be the time to tell me. I've told you everything I know, Mr. Goodwin. I visited Mr. Hewitt. We discussed artwork. I left. Okay. Whatever happened 3 weeks later has nothing to do with me. He glanced at his watch. Expensive, probably Swiss, definitely deliberate. If you'll excuse me, I have clients arriving shortly. One more question. Did your grandmother really commission Chinese artwork for the museum? Of course, she's been collecting Chinese pieces for years. The museum was going to showcase them. Was past tense? He paused. Will. The museum is still being built, Mr. Goodwin. My grandmother's plans haven't changed just because the architect died. Who's designing it now? Gerald Morse, I assume. He was Mr. Hewitt's partner. Does your grandmother approve of that? My grandmother approves of quality work. If Mr. Morse can deliver that, she'll be satisfied. I thanked him and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that David Brennan knew more than he was saying. Maybe a lot more. I got back to the brownstone at 4:30 to find Wolfe in his chair, drinking beer and reading something that had put a small, satisfied smile on his face. You look pleased with yourself, I said. I'm pleased with myself. While you were interrogating art dealers, I was conducting research. Sit down and take notes. I sat and opened my notebook. Research on what? On David Brennan, his gallery, and his business practices. Specifically on a lawsuit filed against him 6 months ago by a collector named Arthur Chen. What kind of lawsuit? Mr. Chen alleged that David Brennan sold him a Chinese jade sculpture purporting to be from the Eastern Han Dynasty. Circa 100 CE, Mr. Chen paid $50,000 for it. A subsequent analysis by experts determined the piece was a forgery well executed, but manufactured within the last 20 years, not 2,000 years ago. I felt something click. Let me guess. Sculpture looked a lot like the one in Richard Hewitt's study. According to the photographs in the court documents, it was nearly identical. Same dynasty, same period, same style, same subjecta, jade dragon on a wooden base. So Brennan sold a fake, got sued for it, and the lawsuit was settled out of court 3 months ago. Terms confidential. But Mr. Chen withdrew his complaint and Mr. Brennan continued operating his gallery without interruption. How much did the settlement cost him? Court documents don't specify, but one can assume it was substantial enough to satisfy Mr. Chen and make the problem disappear. I thought about David Brennan in his expensive gallery, with his expensive clothes and his carefully sophistication. What if the sculpture Brennan sold to Chen wasn't the only fake? What if he's been selling forgeries for years? That would be a lucrative business, Archie. Chinese antiquities are selling for enormous sums, 50,000, 100,000, sometimes more. If one could produce convincing forgeries and sell them to wealthy collectors who don't subject them to rigorous analysis, one could make a considerable fortune. And if Richard Hewitt discovered that Brennan was selling fakes, then Richard Hewitt would have written about it in his journal. He would have documented his suspicions, his evidence, perhaps even his intention to report Brennan to the authorities. David Brennan would have had a very strong motive to steal that journal and silence the man who wrote it. But Brennan has an alibi. He was at his gallery opening Tuesday night, indeed, which means either he hired someone to kill Richard Hewitt, or ... double quotes, or someone else killed Richard Hewitt for reasons connected to David Brennan, but not controlled by him. Like who? Like someone who stood to lose as much or more than David Brennan if his forgery business were exposed. Someone who had access to the Hewitt apartment? Someone who knew about the journal and what it contained? You think Brennan had a partner? I think forgery on this scale requires more than one person. Yes. Someone must create the fakes. Someone must sell them. Someone must handle the provenance and documentation. David Brennan deals in art, but that doesn't mean he makes it. The phone rang. It was Marion Hewitt, and her voice had the shaky quality of someone who'd just discovered something unpleasant. Mr. Goodwin, I found something. In Richard's study, I was going through his papers, and I found a letter. It was filed under B for Brennan. What does it say? It's from Richard to David Brennan, dated September 20th.
Oh.
6 days before Richard died, it says. ... double quotes, her voice trembled. It says that Richard has reason to believe the jade sculpture David sold to Arthur Chen was a forgery, and that he suspects other pieces David has sold may also be fraudulent. It says Richard has documented evidence and intends to contact the district attorney's office unless David voluntarily shuts down his gallery and makes restitution to his victims. That's motive for murder. There's more. The bottom, Richard wrote a note to himself, discussed with GM. He agrees we must act. Meeting scheduled for September 26 to finalize plans. GM, Gerald Morse. That's what I assumed. But Mr. Goodwin, if Richard and Gerald were planning to expose David Brennan, and if Richard was killed before that could happen, ... then either David Brennan killed him, or someone connected to Brennan's forgery operation did. But David has an alibi. Alibis can be arranged, Mrs. Hewitt, especially by people with money and connections. I hung up and reported to Wolfe, who listened with his eyes closed and his fingers interlaced. September 20th, he said when I finished. Richard Hewitt wrote to David Brennan on September 20th, threatening to expose him. Richard Hewitt died on September 26th. That gives Brennan 6 days to plan a murder, arrange an alibi, and execute a killing that would look like a burglary. 6 days is enough time. More than enough. The question is, who did Brennan hire to do it? Who had the skills, the access, and the willingness to commit murder for money? And why steal the journal if Hewitt had already written the letter? Because the journal contained more than just suspicions, Archie. It contained evidence. Dates, names, transactions, perhaps. Even photographs or documentation that would prove the forgery scheme beyond doubt. The letter threatened exposure. The journal would guarantee it. So we need to find the journal. No, Archie. We need to find the killer. The journal is evidence of motive, but it won't tell us who pulled the trigger. For that, we need to examine the one connection we haven't fully explored. What connection? Gerald Morse. According to Richard's note, he discussed the Brennan situation with GM, presumably Gerald Morse, and they agreed to act. Morse was scheduled to meet with Richard. On September 26th, the day Richard died, you think Morse is involved? I think Gerald Morse knew about Richard's discovery. I think he knew about the planned exposure of David Brennan. And I think it's quite interesting that Richard Hewitt died on the exact day. He and Gerald Morse were supposed to meet to finalize their plans. Morse was in Boston, so he says, and so his alibi confirms. But alibis, Archie, can be manufactured as easily as jade sculptures. The question is whether his was real or merely convincing. He picked up the phone. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we need to speak with Gerald Morse immediately. Tell him to bring the train tickets and hotel receipts that establish Morse's alibi. I want to examine them personally. Kramer arrived at the brownstone at 6 o'clock Tuesday evening with Gerald. Morse in tow, and an expression that suggested he was doing this under protest and would be sending Wolfe a bill for his trouble. This better be good, Wolfe, I dragged. Mr. Morse away from a client meeting because you said it was urgent? It is urgent, Inspector. Sit down, both of you. Mr. Goodwin, get Mr. Morse some coffee. I got coffee. Morse took it with a polite nod, but his hand shook slightly when he lifted the cupola first crack. I'd seen in his carefully controlled facade. Wolfe studied him like a naturalist examining a new species of insect. Mr. Morse, when did you last see Richard Hewitt alive? Monday, September 25th, at the office. We had a brief meeting in the afternoon about the museum project. What time? Around 4 o'clock? We talked for maybe 20 minutes. What did you discuss? Construction bids, timeline, the usual business matters. Did you discuss David Brennan? Morse's cup stopped halfway to his lips. David Brennan. Why would we discuss him? Because Richard Hewitt had discovered that Mr. Brennan was selling forged Chinese antiquities, because he had written to Mr. Brennan threatening to expose him. And because he had discussed the matter with you and arranged a meeting for September 26th, the day he died, to finalize plans. I don't know what you're talking about, don't you? Wolfe leaned forward. Richard Hewitt wrote a note. To himself, discussed with GM, he agrees we must act. Meeting scheduled for September 26th. GM, Mr. Morse. Your initials. Your agreement. Your meeting. Morse set down his cup carefully. Yes. All right. Richard did discuss the Brennan situation with me. He suspected David was selling fakes, said he had evidence, wanted my opinion on how to proceed. I advised cautions, suggested we gather more proof before making accusations. We were supposed to meet Tuesday evening to review what he'd found. But you were in Boston Tuesday evening. Yes. I left Monday afternoon on the 4 o'clock train. The meeting with Richard was supposed to be earlier in the day. But he called Monday evening and asked to postpone it until I returned Wednesday. He said he needed more time to organize his evidence. Did he say what evidence? He mentioned his journal. Said he'd been documenting everything, dates, transactions, conversations. He was very thorough, Richard. Very methodical. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. And yet when you returned Wednesday, Richard was dead and the journal was missing. Yes. I didn't know about the journal being gone until you just mentioned it. The police never told me, because they thought it was a burglary, Kramer interjected. Which it still might be, Wolfe, if you'd stop trying to make this more complicated than it is. On the contrary, Inspector, I'm trying to make it as simple as it actually is. Which is quite simple indeed. Once one understands the timing, he turned back to Morse. Mr. Morse, show me your train ticket for Monday. The one that proves you left New York at 4 o'clock? Morse pulled out his wallet and extracted a ticket stub. Wolfe examined it, then passed it to me. I looked at its standard ticket, New York to Boston, dated September 25th, showing a departure time of 4 p.m. And your hotel receipt? Morse produced that too. The Ritz-Carlton, Boston. Check-in September 25th at 6:47 p.m. Check-out September 26th at 11:30 a.m. Wolfe studied the receipt for a long moment. Then he said something that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. This receipt is authentic. Your alibi is genuine. We're indeed in Boston on Tuesday night when Richard Hewitt was killed. He leaned back. Which means you didn't kill him. I believe you know who did. Morse's face went pale. I don't. Don't lie to me, Mr. Morse. I have no patience for lies, and you have no skill at telling them. Richard Hewitt discovered David Brennan's forgery operation. You and Richard agreed to expose it. But someone didn't want that exposure. To happen, someone with enough to lose that they were willing to commit murder to prevent it. Someone who knew about Richard's journal, knew about your planned meeting, knew that they had only a short window of time to act before everything was revealed. David Brennan, Kramer said. He's the obvious suspect. Mr. Brennan is the obvious suspect. Yes. But Mr. Brennan was at his gallery opening Tuesday night with 50 witnesses. So either he hired someone to kill Richard Hewitt or ... double quotes, letting the silence stretch. Or someone else connected to the forgery operation decided to act independently who, Morse whispered. That, Mr. Morse, is what you're going to tell us, because I believe you know. I believe you've known all along, but you've been too frightened or too complicit to say anything. I don't know who killed. Richard, I swear then, let me help you remember. Wolfe picked up the hotel receipt again. This receipt shows you checked in at 6:47 p.m. on Monday. The train from New York arrives in Boston at approximately 6:30, which means you went directly from the train station to the hotel, checked in, and then according to your statement to Inspector Kramer, attended a dinner meeting at the hotel restaurant from 8 until 11. That's correct? Who attended this dinner meeting? Potential clients. The Morrison family. They're building a new office complex in Cambridge. Wanted to discuss our firm's services, and you met them at the restaurant. Yes, they were staying. At the hotel as well? How many people attended? 6. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, their architect, consultant, their lawyer, me, and my assistant. Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Your assistant? Yes. Dorothy Vale? She handles much of our client relations, travels with me to major meetings, and Ms. Vale was with you in Boston Tuesday night. Yes. She attended the dinner, stayed at the hotel, returned to New York with me Wednesday morning. Wolfe looked at Kramer. Inspector, did you verify Ms. Vale's presence at this dinner? Kramer flipped through his notes. We confirmed Morse was there. Didn't specifically ask about his assistant. Call the hotel. Ask if Dorothy Vale was registered. There Monday night. Ask if she was present at the dinner meeting. Do it now, please. Kramer, grumbling, picked up the phone and called. 5 minutes later, he hung up with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between surprised and annoyed. Dorothy Vale checked in Monday evening at 7:15. She had her own room. But ... he paused. She checked out early Tuesday. Morning at 6:30 a.m., told the front desk she had a family emergency and needed to return to New York immediately. The room went silent. Wolfe leaned forward. Mr. Morse, where did you think Ms. Vale was Tuesday during the day? I assumed she was resting or working in her room. We'd had a late dinner. I didn't see her until Wednesday morning when we took the train back together. And you didn't think it odd that she'd checked out Tuesday morning and then returned Wednesday? I didn't know she'd checked out. She told me she'd been in her room all day. I had no reason to doubt her, except that she lied to you. Just as she lied to the hotel? Just as she's been lying about where she was Tuesday, September 26th, when Richard Hewitt was shot in his study. Wolfe's voice was cold. Mr. Morse, what is Dorothy Vale's relationship to David Brennan? Relationship? I don't think they know each other. Think harder. Morse's face went through several expressions. Confusion, realization, horror. Oh God, Dorothy. Dorothy collects Chinese art. She's mentioned it several times. Pieces from a gallery in Soho. I never asked which gallery, because you didn't need to ask. The answer was obvious. Once one looked, Dorothy Vale bought forged antiquities from David Brennan. Probably paid substantial sums for them. And when Richard Hewitt discovered that Brennan was selling fakes, Miss Vale realized that her expensive purchases were worthless, that she'd been defrauded, that she'd lost tens of thousands of dollars, perhaps more. But that gives her motive to kill Brennan, not Richard, does it? Consider the sequence of events, Mr. Morse. Richard discovers Brennan's forgery operation. He writes to Brennan, threatening exposure, discusses it with you, schedules a meeting for Tuesday to finalize plans. But who else knew about this meeting? Who had access to Richard's calendar, his correspondence, his schedule? Dorothy. She manages our calendars, handles our correspondence, knows everything about our business. Precisely. Ms. Vale knew that Richard was planning to expose Brennan. She knew that exposure would mean investigation, publicity, scandal. She knew that collectors who'd bought Brennan's fakes would sue him, ruin him, possibly send him to prison. And she knew that if Brennan went down, he'd take his client list with him, a list that would reveal Dorothy Vale as someone foolish enough to spend her savings on forgeries, She'd lose the money and the reputation, I said. Exactly, Archie. For someone in Ms. Vale's position, an executive assistant earning a salary, not an inheritance, the loss of tens of thousands of dollars would be catastrophic. But the loss of reputation would be worse. Her employer would know she'd been duped. Her colleagues would mock her. Her career would be damaged, perhaps destroyed. She'd become the woman who couldn't tell real art from fake art, who'd been conned by a gallery owner half her age. Morse had his head in his hands. Dorothy couldn't have. She couldn't kill someone. She did kill someone, Mr. Morse. On Tuesday morning, September 26th, she checked out of the hotel in Boston at 6:30 a.m., citing a family emergency. She took the early train back to New York, probably the 7 o'clock express, which arrives at Grand Central at noon. She went to her apartment, changed clothes, and at some point during the afternoon or early evening, she took the stolen master key that she'd obtained from the building superintendent's key cabinet, probably. Weeks earlier, when she was planning this and, she let herself into Richard Hewitt's apartment. But Richard was killed between 9 and 10 Tuesday night, Kramer said. The medical examiner was clear about that. Was he? Or did he estimate time of death based on body temperature and lividity, both of which can be misleading, particularly if the killer takes steps to manipulate them? Wolfe turned to Kramer. Inspector, I suggest you have your medical examiner re-examine his findings. I suspect you'll discover that Richard Hewitt was killed earlier than 9 p.m., perhaps as early as 6 or 7. While it was still daylight, Ms. Vale killed him, stole his journal, staged the burglary, and left. The body wasn't discovered until Marion Hewitt returned home at 10:30. Then why did the me think he died at 9? 'Cause Ms. Vale is clever. She'd planned this carefully. She knew that if Richard appeared to die at 9 p.m. while she was visibly absent from New York, she'd have an alibi.
Oh.
So she manipulated the crime scene, perhaps adjusted the thermostat to keep the body warm, perhaps staged the position to affect lividity. I don't know the specific method, but I know it was done. Morse looked up, his face stricken. Where is Dorothy now? Wolfe said is an excellent question. Mr. Goodwin, call Ms. Vale's apartment. I called. No answer. I let it ring 20 times, then hung up. Nothing. Called the office. I called Hewitt and Morse Architecture. The receptionist answered. Is Dorothy Vale there? I asked. No, she called in sick this morning. Said she had the flu. Nice. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. She called in sick. Claims she has the flu, or she's running. Realizing that her crime is about to be discovered, she's fleeing before Inspector Kramer can arrest her. Wolfe turned to Kramer. Inspector, I suggest you issue an immediate warrant for Dorothy Vale's arrest on suspicion of murder. Check airports, train stations, bus terminals. She's either still in the city, or she's trying very hard to leave it. Kramer was already on his feet, reaching for his phone. This Wolfe. I'm not wrong, Inspector. I'm never wrong. Or at least, not often enough to matter. They found Dorothy Vale at Penn Station 2 hours later, waiting for the 9 o'clock train to Chicago with a suitcase full of clothes, $40,000 in cash, and Richard Hewitt's journal in her handbag. She confessed before they even got her to the station. Told them everything, how she'd bought 3 jade sculptures from David Brennan over the past 2 years, paying $50,000 for each one, how she'd been devastated to learn they were fakes when Richard Hewitt started his investigation, how she'd realized that exposure of Brennan would mean exposure of her own foolishness, how she'd decided the only way to protect herself was to stop Richard before he could. Ruin everything. She'd planned it meticulously, stolen the master key weeks earlier, checked train schedules, established an alibi in Boston. Morning, she'd left the hotel early, taken the train back to New York, and gone to Richard's apartment while he was working in his study. She'd shot him with a gun she'd bought illegally months before, something she'd mentioned casually to Kramer, as if purchasing murder weapons was a normal hobby, staged the burglary to make it look random. The medical examiner revised his time of death estimate after re-examining the evidence. Richard Hewitt had died around 6 p.m., not 9. Dorothy had manipulated the crime scene to suggest a later death turned up the heat. Positioned the body near a radiator, various small tricks that had thrown off the initial calculations. Everything had gone according to plan, except for Nero Wolfe. Noticing that plans which go according to plan are usually too perfect to be true, Wednesday morning, Wolfe summoned everyone to the brownstone, Marion Hewitt, Gerald Morse, Inspector Kramer, and even David Brennan, who arrived looking like a man who'd just realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. They gathered in the office at 11 o'clock. Wolfe was in his chair, freshly returned from his morning session with the orchids, wearing a yellow shirt that made him look like a very large and very satisfied canary. I was at my desk with my notebook ready to record whatever pronouncements he was about to make. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, "we are here because a crime was committed. And because crimes, like weeds or facial hair, do not disappear simply because we ignore them. They must be examined, understood, and resolved." "Dorothy Vale has already confessed," Kramer said. "We don't need a lecture, Wolfe." "Perhaps you don't, Inspector. But Mrs. Hewitt deserves to understand how her husband died and why. As do Mr. Morse and Mr. Brennan, both of whom played roles in this tragedy, whether they intended to or not." He poured beer with the deliberation of a priest preparing communion. "Let me tell you what actually happened, and more importantly, let me tell you why it had to happen the way it did." He drank, set down his glass, and began. Richard Hewitt was a meticulous man. Everyone who knew him agreed on this point. He checked windows, he organized files, he planned everything years in advance. Such men do not die in random burglaries. They die because someone has planned their deaths with the same care they brought to their own lives. September 5th. David Brennan visited Richard Hewitt's apartment to discuss artwork for the Brennan Museum. During this visit, Mr. Brennan made a mistake. A small mistake, but ultimately fatal. He recognized Richard's jade sculpture, commented on its value, and mentioned that similar pieces had sold at auction for $50,000. This was merely conversation, meaningless small talk about art and antiquities. But Richard Hewitt was not a man who engaged in meaningless conversation. He listened, he observed, and he remembered. And after Mr. Brennan left, Richard began to think about jade sculptures and auction prices, and the lawsuit that had been filed against H. David Brennan by Arthur China lawsuit Richard had read about in the newspaper, as he read about everything related to art and architecture. Richard began to investigate. He contacted Arthur Chen, learned about the forged sculpture, examined the photographs from the lawsuit. He discovered that the fake Chen had purchased was nearly identical to his own authentic piece, which suggested that whoever created the forgery had used Richard's sculpture as a model. Perhaps they'd photographed it during a visit to his apartment. Perhaps they'd examined it closely while pretending to admire it. Richard documented his findings in his journal, wrote to David Brennan on September 20th, threatening to expose the forgery operation. And he discussed the matter with Gerald Morse, his trusted partner, agreeing that they would gather more evidence and then contact the authorities. But Richard made a crucial error. He underestimated the number of people who had something to lose if David Brennan's forgery operation were exposed. Wolfe turned to Dorothy Vale's empty chair. Kramer had refused to bring her from jail, saying she'd already confessed and didn't need to hear Wolfe gloated, addressed it as if she were there. Dorothy Vale had bought 3 jade sculptures from David Brennan over the past 2 years. She paid $50,000 for a $150,000 total. For a woman earning a modest salary, this represented years of savings. Careful investment, the accumulation of wealth that would secure her future. When Richard Hewitt began investigating David Brennan, Ms. Vale realized the truth. Her sculptures were worthless. She'd been duped, conned, defrauded. She'd lost everything she'd worked for. She'd lost it to a man half her age, who'd smiled and lied and sold her beautiful, expensive fakes. But worse than losing the money was the prospect of everyone knowing she'd lost it. Her employer, her colleagues, her friends. They'd all learned that Dorothy Vale, the competent, efficient, intelligent Dorothy Vale, had been foolish enough to believe that jade sculptures worth $50,000 could be purchased from a Soho gallery without extensive authentication. She'd be humiliated. Her reputation would be destroyed. Her career would suffer. She'd become an object of pity or mockery, And for someone like Ms. Vale, proud, ambitious, careful, that was unacceptable. So she decided to prevent it. She would stop Richard Hewitt from exposing David Brennan. She would steal the journal that contained the evidence. She would make it look like a random burglary so no one would connect it to Brennan, or the forgeries, or her own foolish purchases. But she needed an alibi. She couldn't simply kill Richard and hope no one suspected her. She needed to be visibly, provably elsewhere when the murder occurred. So she arranged to accompany Gerald Morse to Boston on Monday for a client meeting. She checked into the hotel, attended the dinner, established her presence. Then, on Tuesday morning, she checked out early, claiming a family emergency, and took the train back to New York. She arrived at Grand Central at noon. She had already stolen the building superintendent's master key weeks earlier. A simple matter of visiting the basement and taking it when Walsh was distracted. She waited until evening, when she knew Richard would be home and Marion would be at her museum board meeting. She let herself into the apartment, found Richard in his study, and shot him with a gun she'd purchased illegally for this specific purpose. Then she staged the burglary. She opened the window knowing it would seem impossible, knowing it would suggest a crime more complicated than it actually was. She took some cash, some small valuables, Richard's wallet. Most importantly, she took his journal, the evidence that would expose Brennan, and by extension, her own gullibility. Finally, she manipulated the crime scene to suggest Richard had died later than he actually had. She turned up the thermostat, positioned the body near the radiator, used various techniques to maintain body temperature and delay the onset of rigor mortis. When the medical examiner arrived hours later, his estimate of time of death would be wrong, would place Richard's death at 9 p.m., when Dorothy Vale was supposedly in Boston, not at 6 p.m. when she actually killed him. Everything went according to plan. The murder looked like a burglary. The police were satisfied. No one suspected her. Returned to Boston Tuesday evening, met Gerald Morse Wednesday morning, and came back to New York with him, her alibi intact. It was perfect except for three things. Wolfe held up one finger. First, the open window on the 4th floor. Richard Hewitt would never have left it open. This suggested the burglary was staged, which suggested the murder was planned. Another finger, the missing journal. Burglars steal valuables, not personal journals. This suggested the killer wanted something specific, something that would incriminate someone. Third, a third finger, the timing. Richard Hewitt was scheduled to meet with Gerald Morse on September 26 to finalize plans for exposing David Brennan. He died on September 26 before that meeting could occur. This suggested the killer knew about the meeting and acted to prevent it. And the only people who knew about the meeting were Richard, Gerald, and Dorothy. Had access to both their calendars? He lowered his hand. When you combine these three facts with the discovery that Dorothy Vale had checked out of her Boston hotel Tuesday morning, the conclusion becomes obvious. Dorothy Vale killed Richard Hewitt, staged a burglary, manipulated the crime scene, and relied on a manufactured alibi to escape suspicion. It would have worked too. It nearly did work. But she made one critical error. What error? Marion Hewitt asked quietly. She assumed that a perfect plan would be accepted as perfect.
Oh.
She assumed that a burglary which looked exactly like a burglary would be investigated as a burglary. She assumed that police and private detectives would see what they expected to see and ask no further questions. Wolfe's eyes glittered. But I don't accept perfection, Mrs. Hewitt. Perfect crimes are like perfect orchids. They don't exist in nature. They only exist in carefully controlled environments where every variable is managed, every risk is eliminated, every detail is considered, and when I see perfection, I become suspicious. Because in my experience, the only time things go exactly according to plan is when someone has worked very hard to make them appear that way. Everything went according to plan in Richard Hewitt's murder. The window was open, the valuables were stolen, the wallet was missing. Time of death was exactly when it should be for the killer's alibi to work. That was the mistake, not the plan itself. The plan was excellent. The mistake was executing it too perfectly, making it too obvious that everything had been arranged. And once I realized that, the rest followed inevitably. I'd find who had motive, means, opportunity, and an alibi that was too good to be true. The answer was Dorothy Vale. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Marion Hewitt said, "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Thank you for finding the truth." "I found nothing, Mrs. Hewitt. The truth was always there. I merely recognized it and explained it to others." He looked at David Brennan. "Mr. Brennan, you will be hearing from the district attorney's office regarding your forgery operation. I suggest you obtain competent legal counsel." Brennan's face was pale. "I never intended for anyone to die." "Few criminals do, Mr. Brennan. Yet people die nonetheless, because criminals create situations where desperate people make desperate decisions. Dorothy Vale killed Richard Hewitt because you sold her worthless forgeries for $150,000. You bear responsibility for that death. Whether you pulled the trigger or not, I'll make restitution. I'll shut down the gallery. You'll do whatever the court orders you to do. I'll leave. I find your presence offensive." Brennan left. Gerald Morse followed shortly after, murmuring apologies to Marion Hewitt and avoiding everyone's eyes. Inspector Kramer stayed long enough to grunt something that might have been good work or might have been go to hell with Kramer. It was hard to tell, and then he left too. Marion Hewitt remained in the red leather chair, looking smaller and older than she had when this started. "Mrs. Hewitt," Wolfe said gently, which for him meant without obvious contempt, "your husband was a good man who discovered a crime and tried to stop it. He died because someone else's crime intersected with his own sense of justice. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's better than believing he died randomly, senselessly, without purpose." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe." After she left, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes. Then he said, "Archie, what's for lunch?" "Fritz is making coq au vin. It's excellent. I have earned it." "You have, though I did most of the legwork." "Legwork is easy, Archie. Anyone can walk around asking questions and writing down answers. The difficult part is understanding what the answers mean, recognizing patterns, seeing what others miss." He poured more beer. "You did adequately, however. I'll mention it in my will." "Your will."
That.
"Reminds me this whole thing started because Richard Hewitt changed his will 3 weeks before he died." "It did. A coincidence that seemed significant but turned out to be irrelevant. Richard changed his will because he wanted to ensure Gerald Morse could continue their work. It had nothing to do with David Brennan or Dorothy Vale or the forgery operation. Sometimes, Archie, a will change is just a will change. And sometimes an open window is just an open window." "No," Wolfe said flatly. "An open window on the 4th? The floor is never just an open window. It's either a mistake or a message. In this case, it was both a mistake by Dorothy Vale in her attempt to stage a perfect burglary and a message to anyone paying attention that something was wrong." He picked up his book back to Escoffier now, having apparently exhausted Bria Souvernand. "Settled in to read. I sat at my desk and thought about Dorothy Vale in her jail cell, about David Brennan in his gallery, surrounded by fake art and real consequences, about Gerald Morse trying to run an architectural firm without his partner, about Marion Hewitt in her apartment with her watercolors and her grief. Everything had gone according to plan. That was the mistake. But it was also, I reflected, the solution. Because if Dorothy Vale had been a little less perfect, a little less careful, a little less convinced that she could control every variable, she might have gotten away with it. Instead, she'd created a crime so meticulously planned that it could only have been deliberate. And deliberate crimes always leave trails, no matter how carefully they're hidden. "Archie," Wolfe said without looking up from his book, "stop philosophizing and prepare the invoice for Mrs. Hewitt. 5 days at $100 per day, plus expenses. Total of $635, already done. Mailed. It this morning." "Excellent. Then go help Fritz with lunch. He's been muttering about something involving wine reduction, and I want to ensure he doesn't reduce it too far." I went to help Fritz, leaving Wolfe alone in his office with his beer, his book, and his satisfaction at having solved another crime that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. It was, all things considered, a good day's work, even if most of the actual work had been done by me, 3 weeks later. I read in the Times that David Brennan had been indicted on 17 counts of fraud. He'd pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, 5 years in prison, restitution to his victims, permanent closure of his gallery. Apparently, when they'd searched his studio, they'd found molds, chemicals, and documentation for dozens of forgeries stretching back 7 years. He'd made nearly $2 million selling fake Chinese antiquities to collectors who trusted his expertise and didn't ask enough questions. Dorothy Vale was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. During her trial, she'd maintained that she'd acted to protect herself, that Richard Hewitt's exposure of Brennan would have destroyed her life, that she'd had no choice. The jury hadn't agreed, either had the judge. Gerald Morse sold Hewitt and Morse Architecture to a larger firm for an undisclosed sum. He told reporters he couldn't continue without his partner, that the work they'd done together was too important to risk damaging by doing it alone. The Brennan Museum was completed by the new firm, using Richard Hewitt's designs. It opened to critical acclaim 18 months later. Marion Hewitt donated $1 million to the Architectural Education Foundation her husband had established. She continued painting watercolors, joined a grief support group, and eventually started dating a museum curator who appreciated both her art and her intelligence. I saw her picture in the society pages a year later, smiling at a gallery opening, looking like someone who'd finally figured out how to be happy. As for Wolfe, he returned to his orchids, his meals, his beer, and his books. He never mentioned the Hewitt case again, except once when Inspector Kramer came by to grudgingly admit that Wolfe had been right about the window. "I should have seen it," Kramer said, smoking his 5th cigar of the visit. "Should have realized a 4th-floor window meant something." "You should have," Wolfe agreed. "But you were looking for a simple solution, a burglary, a tragedy. Nothing more complicated than bad luck." Humans prefer simple solutions, Inspector. They're easier to accept and easier to explain. The problem is that murderers also prefer simple solutions, and they work very hard to provide them. So when something looks too simple, usually the world is complicated, Inspector. Murders are complicated. Only the stories we tell ourselves about them are simple. He poured beer. "Now leave. You're interfering with my digestion." Kramer left, and Wolfe returned to his book. I sat at my desk, updating the germination records and thinking about plans that go too perfectly. Windows that open when they shouldn't, and the curious fact that sometimes the best way to hide a crime is to make it look exactly like what everyone expects a crime to look like, until someone like Nero Wolfe comes along and points out that expectations are for fools, and reality is for detectives. It was, I decided, a pretty good philosophy even. If Wolfe would never admit to having a philosophy in the first place, the end.